What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So of course the Assassin reworks are finally out and we're getting a chance to finally take a look and play them on the PBE after so much hype and speculation and just so much anticipation for the upcoming big set of reworks. And in this video we're taking a look at REWORK Katarina. We'll also have videos for Talon, Rengar, and LeBlanc coming as fast as we can get them, but we definitely do still want to take the time to learn the champions and really get a nice feel for how they play out. And overall, REWORK Katarina is something that honestly really impressed me. It was something that it was a little bit tricky because I wasn't entirely sure if it was going to be all that good because it looked like Riot introduced a lot of new mechanics with her. But overall, it actually turns out that it was honestly, in my opinion, just amazing in terms of design. She is so much fun to play. It's honestly incredible, and I had an absolute blast playing her on the PBE. And overall, she definitely plays a very similar playstyle to the old Katarina, so if you're a Katarina main, I can definitely tell you that you are going to love this rework for sure once you get used to it. Just give it a shot, give it 5-10 games, and after that I think you're going to be loving it for sure. She is actually a little bit harder to play compared to before, but her new W actually gives her just a crazy overwhelming amount of options. She has so much stuff that she can do, and one trade-off though as a result is that her damage is generally just a little bit more delayed. So her like super instant burst combos don't entirely exist anymore, but her damage is still in general quite a tiny bit higher before the rework, so overall it actually works out quite nicely. The burst is a bit slower because you have to like pick up your daggers, wait for them to actually spawn after using the abilities and stuff, but the wave clear potential is also a lot nicer as well. She's got some crazy options with the Shumpo resets, and overall her damage is actually, yeah, I do think it is actually higher. Once you can, if you assume that you land every ability possible, her overall damage combo does do a massive amount of damage. So in terms of design, Katarina honestly might have the best rework of just all of them as far as the assassins go, because it's really just so much fun to play and it opened up so many new weaknesses while also giving her so many new strengths without causing any huge glaring holes in terms of design health or gameplay issues. So let's jump right into her abilities. So her passive, of course, is the same passive that we all know and love, Katarina, with the resets the same as before the rework, exactly the same. You get a 15-second reset on all of your abilities after scoring a kill or assist. Now, just like always, this is such an awesome part of her kit and makes her a lot of fun to play, really snowbally in fights, very exciting, high risk, high reward champion, and it's definitely something that is very appealing to Katarina players, so I'm very glad that they actually kept it in. So for her Q, it's a little bit different now. It only bounces to 3 targets instead of the possible 5 that you could before, and after it bounces to 3 targets, it will spawn a blade, which is her new mechanic, this whole idea of like spawning blades on the ground. So it will spawn a blade at the back of the last target hit. So it is actually a predictable, location where the blade's going to spawn. It's consistent in terms of the mechanics. So you can definitely predict and kind of position it in a way that you can control where the blade spawns at least a little bit. And overall, the Q does a little bit less damage in general because the focus is definitely a lot more on the actual blade that spawns. And speaking of the blade mechanics, her new W is all about that. So what it does is that it throws a blade up in the air that will spawn on the ground after a short duration, and during that time, 1.5 seconds, Katarina gains a massive burst of movement speed. So this is also the second ability in her kit that allows her to spawn a blade, so it's only the 2 abilities that can spawn blades, but it's definitely really awesome because it pretty much is a much more controlled version of where you can decide to spawn your blades and stuff and put them around in the area. So her new Shumpo is actually super awesome, but there's a couple of mechanics changes and just stuff in general. So the first thing that is kind of a little bit of a bummer is that she can no longer hop to wards. She can't hop to wards, she can't hop to objects like thresh lanterns or anything like that. I had a game where I was actually accidentally a little bit overextended, tried to hop to a thresh lantern, and then I ended up realizing that you can't actually do that anymore. You can only hop to blades, minions, monsters, and champions. And the trade-off for that is that now when you hop to a blade, it will reset the Shunpo cooldown by a very large percent. Now that percent scales with your level, and when you get to really high levels, it ends up being something above 90%. It starts closer around 75%, 80% in the early levels, but it definitely does scale up to the point where it pretty much becomes a full-on reset. Now for the actual blade mechanics, what happens when she stands on a blade or just, Shunpos to it, it does this AoE kind of thing similar to her old W in the pre-rework. Now this ability of standing on the blade actually does a ton of damage, and it's a massive, pretty much the biggest main source of damage in her kit now, and as a result, you really do need to use your blades like a ton to just get that damage combo on your opponents. And there's also a couple interesting mechanics too. With the Shunpo cooldown reset, you don't actually have to Shunpo to the blade, you can just pick up the blade. So you can Shunpo to like your opponent or to just an enemy, or maybe you're trying to Shunpo as an escape and then you Q a minion and then pick up the blade and you get that cooldown reset. And of course, if you pick up 2 blades, that's an instant Shunpo reset. So the cooldown resetting mechanics on the Shunpo with the blades are super clean. They feel great. They feel really just super slick, and it's exactly what you would want as a Katarina player. And of course, her ultimate is pretty much the exact same ability. There's now a more sophisticated range indicator on it, so your opponents can see like when they're not going to be taking damage from it, but it's definitely pretty much the exact same stuff there. It has maybe a little bit of a longer cooldown, but overall, it was still a lot of fun to play with and definitely very powerful. So a couple of tricks with their abilities, the Q and the Shunpo resets are definitely like something that is just so amazing to play with, and you can really use the Q as like a range extender, and then you Shunpo to the blade, and then you can Shunpo again because you get the reset. So you can use that as like a really long range initiation. Potentially if you throw a flash in there, you can honestly just jump at people from such a large distance. It's awesome. And so it gives her a lot more initiation power and potential really, but you can also use the W as an escape tool if you kind of like position it in a defensive position or just like a little bit further back, and then you jump in with using your Q. So you Q your opponent, you get the blade, and so as a result you get a Shunpo reset from the blade that comes from your Q. You get the damage proc on your opponent from picking up the blade. You maybe throw in an auto attack there if you want to proc your Thunderlords, and since you have that Shunpo reset, you jump right back to the blade on your W. And it's a little bit tricky though, because it is something that you have to preemptively set up, because you can't hop to wards anymore, you can't hop to objects, so you either have to just hope that the minions are there at the right time, but you can definitely preemptively set up your W. So it is definitely like a little bit tricky to play with. It feels a little bit kind of weird at first, but once you start getting the hang of it, getting used to it, the strategies and mechanics, it's honestly so much fun, and Katarina is just an absolute blast, and I'm absolutely loving the new mechanics and just playing her in general. Now for her laning phase, she's kind of transitioned her laning phase playstyle at least a little bit. She's a lot less poke oriented now, where you kind of just sit back, throw your blades, maybe just try to get the best CS that you can until you get level 6. She's not really like that anymore. Now, because her actual Q proc doesn't actually deal that much damage, the damage is all on picking up the blades and landing that. So now she becomes a lot more all-in oriented, and jumping in on your opponent, getting a nice little trade of just a decent amount of harass, and then jumping out, or just committing completely and going for the kill. So she is a lot more all-in oriented, which is a much more risky way to play the laning phase, but she has a lot more options. She's got a lot more escapes as well that don't rely on her getting the kill. Previously you'd have to get the kill if you want to end up being able to Shunpo out, but now you can just set up the W, Shunpo in using your Q to get the reset, and then Shunpo out, and then you get the reset again. So you're not even that vulnerable at all really, because you at the end of the combo have your Shunpo back up off cooldown with the final reset. So her laning phase is, I would say it's probably a little bit more challenging to play, but I'm not going to say that it's necessarily worse, because she definitely still does have a lot of decent harass, and her all-in potential is honestly great. So she can definitely score some kills in the laning phase even before level 6. And one thing that's also flying a little bit under the radar is that Katarina has gained flat HP regeneration. Her flat HP regen pretty much doubled, which is amazing for her early laning phase. It's absolutely great. It's very noticeable, honestly, because it was an increase of like 80% or something, from 3.5 to like maybe from like 4 to 7 or something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was a very big increase. And overall, it makes her laning phase a lot easier to survive in the early laning, and she does have a lot more power in the early levels before actually hitting level 6. So that's definitely a lot more fun to play with, honestly, but it is a lot more challenging, and as a result, at least in my opinion, a lot more interesting and exciting. And her team fighting is honestly super awesome. You know, she's got so much more options, but at the same time, she also has a lot more counterplay. She feels a lot more fair because her damage is essentially delayed, right? Because you have to throw the blades, and the blades have a very consistent time from when they, you know, throw up in the air to actually land on the ground. It's the exact same amount of time every time. And so as a result, the damage is very consistently delayed, which gives opponents potentially a chance to react or anticipate or even dodge the damage if they can. But at the same time, it becomes a lot more strategic oriented. You know, you can't just jump in 1v5 and just press all your buttons. You do have to like position, set up, try to pick people off, and really just like do a lot of tricks, and it becomes a lot more interesting to play, I guess. It is definitely super strong. You know, she's got a ton of AoE damage, and of course the resets are just outstanding. And since her overall damage, if you land all of her abilities, the 2 blades, the E, the W, the Q, if you land everything on someone, it does a lot more damage than her previous combos before. So now you actually do have a lot more potential to score some resets and get a lot of damage out if you happen to catch an opponent out of position. And I think she definitely punishes mistakes a lot harder than she did before, if she didn't already. So I'm really enjoying her team fighting. I think she's got a lot of awesome potential. I mean, overall, I definitely think she's really solid. She does have a decent amount more counterplay just because, you know, the mechanics of the delayed damage and kind of losing a couple things like the ward hops and stuff like that makes her a little bit more vulnerable to ganks and requires you to essentially just play a lot better, really. You know, she's definitely a lot more challenging to play, I do have to say that, but I think the mechanics that have been introduced on Katarina's kit are super fun to play with, which is definitely super important, and she's honestly probably going to be a competitive pick, I would say. You know, she's got a lot more options in fights. She does have more counterplay, but those options can just be crazy. You can jump all over the place with your shumpos. You know, I think she's definitely great. You know, she's a very solid champion in the current state that I played her in. I don't know if I want to say that she's like super overpowered for sure, but she definitely felt pretty strong. And the games that I didn't do well on her definitely felt like it was pilot error. You know, the games that I performed poorly on Katarina in this rework really just totally felt like it was entirely my fault, which is something that I really loved. You know, I never really felt like I got cheated or anything like that. When I did well, I felt like I played well. When I did poorly, I felt like I did poorly. It was a lot of fun to play. And yeah, I think she's definitely a pretty strong pick and should be quite a menace to fear in the future. So looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want, and I'll see you guys next time.